Number one, of course, is China's maritime expansion in the South China Sea, which is simply pushing the Philippines towards, of course, the United States. China's basically uncompromising approach, zero-sum approach. China would often hear China accusing the United States of a zero-sum approach. Look who's talking. Just look at how China is dealing with the smaller Southeast Asian countries. Totally zero-sum approach. No matter you could appease China or not, you will get the same treatment. You'll be run over by the Chinese maritime juggernaut.
This is Pascal from Neutrality Studies, and I am joined tonight by Renato Cruz De Castro, a distinguished professor at the De La Salle University of Manila and one of the Philippines' great academic experts on foreign relations. He has written over 100 articles on international relations and security of the Philippines, Japan, South Korea, and other actors in East Asia and the Pacific. And he recently also wrote a very interesting piece in The Diplomat about the Philippines' quest for balance, Marcos foreign policy, explaining the balancing act that Manila has to currently pull off not to get squeezed between the big bully in the East, China, and the big bully in the West, the United States. Renato, thank you for coming online today.
Thank you. It's a pleasure on my part, Pascal.
You just told me a second ago that it is a super busy time for you because something very important is happening at the moment. What's going on in the Philippines right now?
Now, of course, this is the third day of the massive Chinese naval exercises that, of course, China started the 3 days ago in reaction, of course, to the meeting of President Tsai and, of course, Speaker of the House, Kevin McCarthy. So then tomorrow, we will have a big military exercise, Balikatan 2023, where, of course, you will have almost 12,000 American troops. And, of course, you have 5,000 Filipino troops who will be conducting the military exercise not very far from Taiwan.
So, I mean, this hotspot, Taiwan, is extremely dangerous also to the Philippines, right? Exactly because for that reason. I mean, a meeting between Tsai Ing-wen and the American politicians in the US immediately impacts you in the Philippines.
Sure. Yeah, because again, what President Marcos has always emphasized, explaining why we have to allow greater American strategic footprint in the Philippines. And we are, of course, a prisoner of geography.
Our distance,
yeah.
And you're also prisoners of history, right? Because on the one hand, you've got a very threatening China in the north that is conducting a lot of not only drills but also bullying attempts, like with bullying your Filipino fishermen and trying to occupy like features that are officially recognized as Filipino features. And on the other hand, you've got the United States that promises to support you, but I think the Philippines must be quite aware that U.S. support is a double-edged sword, no?
That's the reality of international relations. You cannot have everything. Everything in international politics has a matter of trade-off, has a price. Nothing is free.
You wrote in that article, that the Philippines has to be very careful not to become the proverbial grass that gets trampled when two elephants fight.
Yes.
What is the current Marcos administration doing to prevent that from happening?
Well, the approach is, of course, to implement a balance. Ideally, of course, you'll have the Philippines leaning to China economically, which I, personally see is also something negative because we don't want to be a victim of Chinese economic predatory practices. On the other hand, of course, we have a treaty alliance with the United States that, of course, had been signed at the onset of the Cold War, 1950. And despite the withdrawal from a huge American bases from the Philippines in 1992, both sides have, of course, decided to continue that security relationship, even during the 6-year term of President Rodrigo Duterte, who wanted to win away the Philippines from the United States. So it's always been there. That's, of course, a mark of Philippine diplomacy and, of course, defense policy, our alliance with the United States.
Which is kind of interesting because the Philippines was a de facto colony of the US for 50 years and then still decided right after gaining independence and after an interim of being occupied by the Japanese to ally itself with the US.
Yeah, because of the experience of the war. It was the Filipino political elite who insisted that the Americans maintain their bases here. That's why the military bases agreement of 1947 was actually an executive agreement between two presidents, President Manuel Rojas and, of course, President Harry Truman. Then, of course, at the onset of the Korean War, the Philippines asked, and of course, it was given a mutual defense treaty with the United States. So that has been, of course, a pillar of Philippine foreign policy until, of course, President Rodrigo Duterte challenged, but of course, eventually failed to win us away from the United States during his 6-year term.
But Mr. Duterte did something that surprised a lot of people, which is he tried not to emphasize that landmark legal victory that the Philippines won in front of the International Court of Justice, right?
A permanent court of arbitration.
Permanent court of
tribunal.
arbitration.
Yeah.
The arbitrational tribunal in 2016, when it was decided that the China's claims to like features in the South China Sea are not valid. So why do you think Duterte tried to go that route and to cuddle up with China?
Oh, this was part of his appeasement policy. You know, he would appease China by winning the Philippines away from the United States, setting aside the bilateral, the arbitral ruling, and subscribing to China's means of managing and eventually resolving the dispute. That is, of course, through bilateral consultation and negotiations.
How far did he get, or how far did that approach go vis-a-vis China? Like, because
Nothing.
China never stopped with the...
No, they continue their gray zone operations. They continue harassing Philippine Coast Guard and Navy ships. And of course, you have instances where you have this of course happened in early 2021 when the Chinese tried to occupy the land feature deep inside the Philippine Exclusive Economic Zone, which forced the Duterte administration to, of course, engage China in a standoff at Winston Shoal. So he never got a lot of the concessions that he was expecting to get from China. More importantly, the $24 billion that China committed to President Duterte when he went to China during his first visit in October 2016. A very small amount of money actually entered the economy. So he practically got nothing in return for appeasing China.
Why is it that China is not trying to woo the Philippines with like offers? You know, why is it that it doesn't make sense to me that China tries to grab that much land and that much sea? Actually, I don't understand why it's not trying to do something more friendly, actually, in order to win over its neighbors.
Well, China, I think, is very powerful. China's approach is basically a matter of subjugation. No concessions, no negotiations. You have to accept my presence there because you're small. I'm big. Yeah, but this is what China told the ASEAN countries in Hanoi. You know, when U.S. Department of State Secretary Hillary Clinton announced the U.S. interests in the South China Sea. Then you have the reaction of China. You know, ASEAN countries are small. China is big. This is a reality you'd have to basically accept. This is China's policy, not only to the Philippines, but to the ASEAN countries.
The United States, with its freedoms of operations, freedom of navigation operations, is doing a similar thing, saying like you have to accept that these waters are open and that all of our boats can go through there. And of course, this is something the Philippines supports very much because it pushes back against China. But it's part of what makes the situation so dangerous for any kind of incidents, doesn't it?
Yes, of course. Yes, of course.
And at the same...
But of course, we have to simply rely on the fact that we got the award from the arbitral tribunal, which basically, of course, rendered China's 9-dash claim as, of course, illegitimate. It's beyond the coverage of both traditional and, of course, the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea.
Yes, yes. I mean, it's absolutely clear. Under international law, the Philippines wins on all accounts and all fronts, which is the reason why China from the beginning didn't take part in
Yes.
the
Yeah.
arbitration, because
That's a big impact. It has a big impact. It basically delegitimizes China's
yes.
claim on
And
this.
one thing is China cares about international law. Actually, China hates it when there's such an obvious case of being the breacher of something. I mean, being in breach of international law. But you're at the same time you're writing also in your article that economically the new administration of Mr. Marcos, who came in with a landslide victory, is one of engagement with China, right?
Yes. But I think they're already having second thoughts because there's a realization that, yeah, China will offer you the goodies, the carrots, open its market, but there's no concession when it comes to the West Philippine Sea or South China Sea issue. So I think the realization happened when, of course, he visited Japan in February. There's a recognition now that the rule of the thumb is, number one, don't rely so much on Chinese public investment because China could use it against you. Second, of course, is the importance of private-public partnership. So a number of the infrastructure projects that this administration would like to implement will not anymore be funded by China's Belt and Road Initiative. Rather, it will be a case of private-public partnership and, of course, tapping Japan. The big ticket items when it comes to infrastructure projects are now being funded by Japan, not by China.
Which one are those?
One is, of course, a rail system that runs from central Luzon down to the southern part of the Luzon. Something like 180 kilometers will be funded by Japan. Then, of course, the bridge that will connect two provinces from Cavite, where I'm staying, to Bataan across the Manila Bay. This will be funded by the Asian Development Bank, which is, of course, funded mostly by Japanese money. And, of course, the real big ticket item project, the most visible one, the subway system that's being funded by the Japan International Cooperation Agency, JICA.
A subway system for Manila?
Yes.
Oh, fantastic news.
Yeah, that's Japan. Japan is basically telling us, offering us, you have to diversify. You cannot be economically dependent on China because China will use it against you. This is something that Australia realized, a number of countries realized. Even before the Philippines, you have Norway that realized it. We realized it in 2012. Of course, Australia experienced it horribly, during the pandemic.
Okay, but let's go again to the base issue, because like when we talk about the defense of the Philippines, it's absolutely clear that the security alliance with the United States is crucial. The way that the security alliance between Japan and the United States is crucial for Japan. But who controls the bases?
They're not American bases.
They are
Filipino bases where you have, of course, called joint locations. These are storage facilities, runways, probably storage facilities that the Americans and the armed forces of the Philippines can use. So they can be improved, built by the Americans. But whatever happens inside those Philippine bases will, of course, have to be monitored by the Filipino base commander.
Okay, so if push comes to shove, the US would not be able to do something without the okay from the Philippines,
the consent
right?
of the Philippine, from the Philippine government through the Philippine base commander.
That makes it different from the way that U.S. Bases in Japan, especially in Okinawa, are run, which are under complete control, extraterritorial control.
Yes, that's why they're not American bases. They're still, of course, the term we use here is joint location. It's joint because they have to be used, and of course, the use of those facilities will be on the base on bilateral consultation.
So is the strategy of the Philippines at the moment to create, because You just recently expanded. There are 4 more bases that can now be used by American troops. That is an agreement that was made a couple of months ago between the Marcos administration
No,
and the
this
US.
was the agreement was originally signed in 2014
Oh, really? Okay.
during the Aquino administration.
For the 4 new
No,
leases.
the original was 5.
Okay.
The agreement was 5, but it was never implemented by the Duterte administration.
He
So
froze it.
the Duterte administration only decided to implement this in the latter part of his term. When he realized that, his dealing with China was a case of unrequited love. He showed China all the affection he can, even at one point telling, in front of the Chinese ambassador, probably it's a joke, but as a president of a country, you never crack this joke. Make the Philippines a province of China.
You said so?
To that, to that extent, yes. And in January 2018, right in front of the Chinese ambassador, when he delivered a speech to the Philippine Chamber of Commerce, he cracked that joke. Make us a province of China. That's how much he loved China. But it was a case really of unrequited love.
Yeah,
so by the end of his term, he gravitated back to the United States.
Yeah, and we are talking about a man who in domestic policy had no qualms with killing thousands or tens of thousands of local Filipinos who were deemed drug addicts or users. But so, I mean, he's a highly controversial personality, but so is Mr. Marcos, the son of the former dictator.
Well, President Marcos was dignified. I'm old enough to remember him. He never announced that he will kill people. It was a case at that time. It was called the smiling martial law.
He never announced it. He just did it, right?
The military did. It will give you a chance. In fact, you have more people that were killed during the Duterte administration than during the martial law period. You have statistics.
Oh, wow.
I was old enough to remember. Most, of course, those who were killed were affiliated with the communist movement. But here, of course, if you're a suspected drug user, you're a fair game for the police.
Yeah, and not in the sense of arrest, but in the sense of being shot extrajudicially.
I still remember at least during the Marcos period, unless of course you're a communist guerrilla, you're a fair game. But if you're, let's say, a communist cadre, you're caught by the government during the martial law period, you'll be given a choice. And not during the Duterte administration. I'm old enough to remember both.
So, what's the new Marcos doing now? I mean,
no, he's not, and he's not. He's not like his father. Definitely not like his father. He's a totally different person, and he definitely is more dignified than the previous president.
And going back to this foreign relations at the moment. Do you see any more tilts of the Philippines toward more support for the US coming? Is it around the corner, or will the Philippines try to maintain the current level of support?
Probably you'll have certain concessions on the part of the United States, but I think the government, President Marcos, would make sure that the Philippines agenda would determine whatever operations would happen on those sites. He already emphasized this. All operations should be defensive. There should be no offensive operation that will emanate from those joint locations. He made it clear.
Because one of the strategies would be to actually start threatening the Chinese positions in the sea. So that is something that the Philippines, Marcos at the moment, wouldn't want to do.
You'll have joint patrols. The Chinese are threatening us. Why can't we give them the compliment in return?
Yes, but there's threat on different levels.
What experience we have.
Mm.
Chinese Coast Guard vessels are driving away ordinary Filipino fishing folks.
Yeah.
So the Chinese maritime expansion is felt by ordinary Filipinos. Filipino fishermen had been driven out from their traditional fishing ground. So how can you expect us just to accept it sitting down?
Of course not. Nobody would, nobody can, and that's why the Philippines has probably the strongest case of feeling is the most threatened by China, apart from Taiwan,
and
which is a
even
different story.
The fact that the Philippines under the Duterte administration has appeased China China continued that behavior. So, I basically would say whether you appease China or challenge China, you'll get the same treatment. You'll be run over by the Chinese juggernaut.
But now, so how to make sure that the on the other hand, nothing happens in terms of an escalation between the U.S. and Taiwan that would have an immediate effect?
We can basically express our concerns, but whether the United States would factor in or not is another matter. The view of the United States, of course, is totally different. From the American perspective, it's integrated deterrence. From our perspective, at least, we try to balance China in a manner that hopefully will not trigger a major conflict. Of course, this is easier said than done.
So where would be the current administration's red lines in terms of what they would be willing to do if like China comes even closer, or if the US would suggest further integration, or like, let's say, the stationing of missiles? Is that something that you see that the Philippines could ever say yes to?
Probably mobile missiles like the HIMARS will be allowed, but I don't think we will allow something what will be a bigger, intermediate range. Well, the United States actually doesn't have intermediate range ballistic missiles because they have dismantled it during the Cold War.
Yes,
So the most they could deploy at this point in time will be the HIMARS, and of course Patriot missiles, air defense. I don't think that will be an issue because right now the Americans and indeed brought a number of their HIMARS and Patriot missiles. So yeah, that's the biggest thing that the Americans could basically deploy there will be Tomahawk, but they have it on their ships.
And the Filipino Navy, in what's the current state of where do they procure their material and their weapons from?
Well, the two brand new frigates were acquired from South Korea, and two more corvettes. During the time of President Rodrigo Duterte, he continued to fund the modernization program, but he made it a point that all the major weapons would have to be sourced from countries aside from the United States. So the Philippine Air Force right now is considering Griffin from Sweden. The order for two corvettes are, of course, being built by South Korea. Or also looking at we already bought some high quality radars from Japan, manufactured by Mitsubishi. So those are the big ticket items.
And do you think this strategy will continue, or would Marcos switch to procuring from the United States?
I think slowly we'll have to acquire, especially now, of course, that the United States will be more than willing to offer certain concessions, especially in terms of the acquisition by the Philippine Air Force of what they call this multi-purpose fighter planes, like possibly the F-16s. So the Philippine Air Force is looking at the possibility of either acquiring Griffins from Sweden or F-16 Vipers from the United States. But of course, the Vipers are very expensive. So there's a possibility, as part of this improving security relationship with the United States, the United States might offer certain concessions when it comes to the acquisition of the F-16 Vipers.
And when we look at the ASEAN context, like, are we to expect more cooperation of the Philippines with like other nations that have a lot of beef with China, especially Vietnam? How much faith do you have in the ASEAN framework to help the Philippines?
ASEAN will be useful in terms of negotiating, of course, for the code of conduct. Within ASEAN, the Philippines hopefully could expect some support from other countries that, of course, have their maritime concerns regarding China's maritime expansion in their respective waters. Talking about Malaysia, Vietnam, Brunei, and even Indonesia, who's actually not a claimant state, but of course is exclusive economic zone north of Natuna Island is, of course, within China's 9-dash line.
Did anyone ever suggest a framework of diplomatic negotiations that could lead to a settlement in the South and East China Sea that could actually work?
No, because from the perspective of Southeast Asia, what's happening in the East China Sea is separate from what's happening in the South China Sea. I think that's also the view from Tokyo. Although Tokyo has a wider perspective. Tokyo knows if there's pressure from the East China Sea from China, probably that could be lightened if the Tokyo would provide assistance to the development of the coast guards of the Southeast Asian countries.
Coast Guard development has been on the agenda since 2010.
Yeah, the Philippines is the
14,
first.
10,
The Philippines is the first beneficiary.
And educating coast guards, but the important thing to know is that coast guards and navies are very different. Coast guards are police forces that enforce national law, whereas navies are part of the military service who shoot at things. Coast guards are supposed to patrol and do police actions. And of course, the Philippines is caught, like your Coast Guard is actually often the one confronting the Chinese vessels, right?
Right. Yes. Right now. Yes. That's a lesson we learned. That's a lesson we learned in 2013. I'm sorry, 2012, during the Scarborough Shoal standoff. You have to confront the Chinese civilian vessels with your Coast Guard.
Yeah, to the point where you run one of your vessels on one of the shoals in order to.
That was earlier. That was in the 1990s.
That was 1990s. Okay.
That was him.
It's a very, very, very tough situation. So I really wonder the danger that you outline of being squeezed between these powers is tremendous. So the Philippines at the same time needs to confront and de-escalate in order to prevent anything bad from happening. I mean, the worst case scenario for both Taiwan and the Philippines is to become a Ukraine in the East. That's
it's a different scenario here. Of course, we're in a better position than Ukraine because this will be maritime.
Yes,
you don't see Chinese tanks just running over us. It's case of an amphibious operation, which of course will be more difficult for China to launch because China has never conducted an expeditionary operation.
That is true. And the Philippines is extremely difficult terrain.
Yeah, to cross. Yeah.
Okay, Renato, can you tell us, like at the very end, what is your expectations for this and next year in terms of the Philippines' overall foreign policy approach?
It will be very challenging because, just like I mentioned, our ability to conduct this balanced foreign policy will depend on factors that are simply beyond our control. The two of them, of course, are external. Number one, of course, is China's maritime expansion in the South China Sea, which is simply pushing the Philippines towards, of course, the United States. China's basically uncompromising approach, zero-sum approach. China would often hear China accusing the United States of a zero-sum approach. Look who's talking. Just look at how China is dealing with the smaller Southeast Asian countries. Totally zero-sum approach. No matter you could appease China or not, you will get the same treatment. You'll be run over by the Chinese maritime juggernaut. Then, of course, the other issue here, where, of course, the Philippines and Taiwan have totally no control of, is the state of U.S.-China relations, especially now that the competition has becoming more tense than ever. The Philippines can only hope for the best, but of course, at the same time, we could also expect for the worst.
Okay, let me ask still one more question. If there was a war in Taiwan about Taiwan that would be and include China and the United States, would the Philippines go to war with the United States, or would the Philippines say, no, we are declaring neutrality?
We cannot declare neutrality. Unlike Switzerland, we're not armed. Switzerland knows for a fact that neutrality has to be armed.
You do have your forces. The Philippines has its forces.
Compared to your forces during the Second World War. You have ME 109 that you use against the Germans. You even attack.
The Swiss strategy would have been to give up all of the major cities, retreat to the mountains, and shoot at them until they stop coming.
But it was tough. The Swiss army was really tough. Yeah, they were even shooting down, attacking American bombers. You even have an undeclared war with the Allies.
The the only Swiss city in the Second World War that got damaged by the war was by the Americans, who said they accidentally bombed one.
Oh,
but the okay, so your take is no, the Philippines has to have the US back.
Because neutrality is actually the more difficult, challenging one, because you're talking about a great power and a superpower. If you want to become neutral, you have to develop a military capability that could at least deter both sides. No country in the world could be able to develop that credible military capability that could deter China or the United States. So you have to settle for the lesser evil. That is, of course, you have to ally with yourself with the superpower.
But well, you don't have to make sure that you can defeat them. You just have to make sure that they wouldn't want to come.
Well, we can make it possible if you have American forces that they will have to take into account.
Well, I mean, look at Vietnam. Vietnam has been very successful in deterring others. But well, okay.
But Vietnam, of course, had arms from the Soviet Union and China during that time. Plus, of course, Vietnam has that really tradition.
Multi-vector foreign policy, getting the weapons from everybody to use them against everybody. The Swiss shot down German airplanes with German airplanes.
ME-109s, and you even captured some. Yeah.
Well,
I'm a war buff. I'm a war buff. I was reading accounts of those battles between the Swiss Air Force and the Luftwaffe. Goling was so angry, this was happening during the summer of 1940.
Of course, and it's not, and you cannot. Switzerland could never ever defeat the entire Luftwaffe, but just make sure that they get the point of, if you come here, you better be prepared to do it for real. And then they said, on the balance of everything, let's not.
So, plus, of course, you have your army, and of course your militias. Those. Yeah.
Plus, you make yourself as useful as possible to both sides. Let them use your gold. Let them use your currency. Let them use whatever it is. Just not your. Just don't come here. Just stay away from the territory. Yeah. But the Philippines, the territory.
It was a close call, actually, also for Switzerland.
It was.
Even armed neutrality would not guarantee. No. Even the United States, right? U.S. armed neutrality, but again. But the worst case scenario is you would, declare neutrality without being armed. The enemies would probably die laughing.
It depends. If your neutrality is in the favor of both other powers, then it will work.
But if you're not armed, they'll just pass over you, like what happened to Belgium.
But nobody invaded ever Liechtenstein or Andorra. Because nobody cares. Because nobody cares.
But the Philippines.
Yes. Yeah. Yes. No, I agree with you on that point. You have to have a credible defense, not an impossibly high one, but one that is
could make the enemy
difficult to overcome.
Twice. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, that's a challenge.
Okay. Renato, we will talk again. Thank you very much.
Okay, sure. Okay. Bye.
Bye.